Hi, I'm Erin Welsh.
And I'm Erin Allman-Updike.
And this is This Podcast Will Kill You.
Today we're talking about the dietary guidelines, part 2.
Part 2. Part 2.
Bringing back the food pyramid.
I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion of rhetoric and just branding. Like, so much of this is branding, even looking at the design of the pyramid, which, like, I didn't talk about that last week, but, like, there has been a lot of intention behind how this information is presented. Committees on committees on committees of, like, how do we turn this? Do we do a pyramid? Should we add stairs? Should we do an upside down triangle? Like, whatever. I guess triangles can't be upside down. But, like,
Right.
Yeah. And it's just, wow.
I know. Well, and it's interesting, too, because historically the, like, dietary guidelines for Americans document has been this, like, pretty large, hefty document that's geared towards professionals, nutrition experts and people who are making the decisions about things, and not the same document that is necessarily geared towards general public, where then they take those dietary guidelines, the DGA, and then make a food pyramid and make this public-facing, information.
Sort of infographic thing.
Yeah, this time it's like we got it. It's all in one. It's just this very short, a few pages, and this is the dietary guidelines. It is public-facing. And so they've kind of just wrapped it all up in one, which is also interesting in and of itself.
It is. Oh, there's so much good stuff today.
Yes.
There's so much good stuff. But first,
it's quarantine time.
It is. What are we drinking again, Erin?
We're drinking your daily apple.
We are. It's a pretty simple beverage. It's got apple juice, pomegranate juice, lemon juice, sparkling water. There you go.
Delish. Refreshing.
Delish.
We'll post the full recipe, as if you need one, on our website, thispodcastwillkillyou.com, and all of our social media. So make sure that you're following us there, so you don't miss it.
Do it. On our website, you can find a whole suite of things. If you're looking for them, you can find sources, you can find transcripts, you can find links to merch, links to bookshop.org affiliate page, our Goodreads list, music by Bloodmobile, contact us form, a submit your firsthand account form, and perhaps a few other tidbits in there if you're, excited to explore. Please have at it.
Rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcatcher or YouTube. If you are into a video version, we have it. Did you know that?
We've got it.
We're there.
Yeah. Maybe you're already watching us, in which case, hi.
Hi. Nice to see you.
Great to see you.
Okay. Shall we get into this week's episode, Erin?
Absolutely.
Okay. We'll take a break and then dive in. Restoring science and common sense. Every American deserves to be healthy, but too many Americans are sick and don't know why. That is because their government has been unwilling to tell them the truth. For decades, the U.S. government has recommended and incentivized low-quality, highly processed foods and drug interventions instead of prevention. Under the leadership of President Trump, the government is now going to tell Americans the truth. Today, the White House released the Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2025 to 2030, the most significant reset of federal nutrition policy in decades. Under President Trump's leadership, common sense, scientific integrity, and accountability have been restored to federal food and health policy. For decades, the dietary guidelines favored corporate interests over common sense, science-driven advice to improve the health of Americans. That ends today. The new dietary guidelines call for prioritizing high-quality protein, healthy fats, fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, and avoiding highly processed foods and refined carbohydrates. If anyone missed last week's episode, part 1 of this 2-part series, Erin, you walked us through the good, the bad, and the ugly, really, of how we got to be here where we are today. So I think we all understand a lot more about where the concept of these dietary guidelines really comes from and the issues that have always been present in the creation of the dietary guidelines for America. And this is a very America-centric couple of episodes, but I will talk about global dietary guidelines today as well.
Mm-hmm.
But today's episode, I am mostly focused on these newest dietary guidelines that came out in January 2026. And what I want to walk through is why it is that they've made such headlines. Like, when was the last time we ever even heard about them being updated? Did you know they were updated in 2020?
No.
Because they were. Of course, they are every 5 years. Why are we hearing so much more about this upside down pyramid than we did the debut of My Plate back in 2011?
My Plate. Still can't believe I missed a whole era of dietary guidelines.
Right. And of course, I think that part of this is down to the time in which we are currently living in, with RFK Jr. being the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, who made it known very clearly and very loudly that he was going to overhaul these guidelines.
Right.
And I think that in some ways, the kind of nutrition community, the wider medical community has been bracing for this. What is it going to look like? And it's very clear that MAHA and the MAHA kind of ideals and ideology has had a very huge hand in shaping these guidelines.
You know, I was thinking about like the Super Bowl commercial with Mike Tyson.
It's Erin, I have so many feelings about it, and I'm not even going to get deep into it.
No, I know. But it's just like, it's funny because, like you said, we didn't, like, there weren't, or maybe there were, and I just missed them because they were so not as ridiculous, like so unridiculous compared to that. I genuinely thought that I was watching like a spoof thing. Like it came up and I was like
an SNL skit.
Yeah, like a 30 Rock thing. I was like, what is happening? And so it is really interesting, the drive for publicity and publicizing these guidelines.
And I think that's one of the big differences that we're seeing, like already off the bat, is the way that these guidelines are being marketed, the way that they're being talked about, the vibes behind them is like totally different than anything that we've seen before. Yeah. It's a lot. And there is a lot that I think that these guidelines kind of bring up that are part of larger discussions. And we don't have time for those larger discussions today. So what I am going to focus on for this episode is how the most recent guidelines, this upside down food pyramid, if we're calling it that, what are the real key differences between these dietary guidelines and every other set of guidelines that has changed minimally over the last several decades? There's 4 key differences that I'm going to kind of go through, some of which are not based at all in science, and some of which are really probably good recommendations, and some of which are somewhere in between. And then we'll compare the current food guidelines now that exist in the US to what guidelines actually look like across the globe. Like, how different are these new recommendations from global recommendations?
I'm so excited for that.
It's going to be great. How are Americans doing on eating according to these guidelines? If we're falling short, in what areas are we falling short and why?
Yeah.
What are the barriers that we see?
Fiber.
And yes, fiber is the answer. And finally, the question that you kind of ended us with last week, Erin, is, does any of this matter? Who is going to be affected by these changes besides our global reputation? Ready?
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to also go good, bad, and ugly. Or like, I'm going to start with like probably beneficial changes, somewhat maybe neutral changes, and then baseless changes that are probably harmful to our health.
Wonder which those are.
I can't wait to tell you. So the first thing to know is that they really are not that different from previous iterations. Guidelines for forever have emphasized the importance of whole grains, whole fruits and vegetables, limiting added sugar, limiting sodium, and limiting our saturated fat to less than 10% of our total calories. That has not changed at all.
Nope.
These guidelines, similar to the guidelines from 2020 as well, also include a one-pager on nutrition information like geared towards infants and toddlers, which is quite well put together and very, very similar to the 2020 guidelines.
Right.
Okay. But there are a few big changes, like I said, 4 that we're going to go through. So the first big change is that this is the first dietary guidelines for Americans to specifically emphasize that we should be avoiding consumption of, quote, highly processed, packaged, prepared, ready to eat, unquote foods or other snacky foods. And they list specifically chips, cookies, candy as the types of foods they're talking about. And they emphasize the need to prioritize what they call nutrient-dense foods. They go so far as to recommend that no amount of added sugars or non-nutritive sweeteners is needed or recommended in a diet. And multiple times in different sections of these guidelines, they call out refined grains, added sugar, and added salt or sodium as something that we should be avoiding, including things like sugar-sweetened beverages, which they have been railing against for a very long time now, and fruit juices. I think their stance against fruit juices is a bit different than previous ones. They also say, and I think this is really interesting, that if you're going to be eating packaged or like snacky foods, to look for ones that meet FDA quote-unquote healthy claim limits. And this is a category that exists. It was like updated in 2024, these like limits on what should constitute a quote-unquote healthy food. No one knows what those are.
What? I've never heard of this. Okay.
No, of course you haven't. Yeah. No one's heard of it. And the thing is that like this is a theoretical category kind of that exists, but there's no like labeling for it. So there's no way that companies can label a food as quote unquote healthy and that you know as a consumer it is sticking to an actual category that the FDA has made. Like that has been proposed, but right now it does not exist. So healthy limits, we don't really know exactly what those are. Okay?
Okay.
They list in the dietary guidelines some specific limits on the amounts of added sugar that should be in a certain amount of ounces of food as part of this healthy claim, but that's it. It's only a limit on sugar, not on anything else, saturated fat or sodium or anything. So this is a potentially beneficial change. However, it does kind of merit a bit more nuance than what the guidelines are giving it.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to talk about processed foods, I think, someday.
We have to, because an in-depth look on what processed foods, or they call them highly processed foods, and that's not a thing that exists. Like, it's not a category of processing. Yeah. There is a classification system called the NOVA classification system that lists minimally processed, and ultra-processed foods. Okay. But highly processed is not technically a term. Now, is that semantics? A little bit. But the problem is that to really like get at the idea of food processing, you have to like, what is it that we're trying to get at here? Right.
Because like it's a little bit like you know it when you see it. Like, yes, we know that certain things are processed, but that are not inherently bad because of that processing.
Exactly.
Most of our food is processed.
Exactly.
But like, to say that and then say, well, then that means all processed food is fine or all processed food is bad. Both of those things are lacking the nuance that is impactful for dietary health.
They're oversimplifications on both, like both ends of the spectrum, essentially.
And people use them in both ways where it's like, well, no, there are clearly highly processed foods that are clearly not good for you.
No one thinks that Cheetos are a health food.
Right.
You know, like
not to name names, but
not to name names, but I don't think anyone is out there eating Cheetos thinking that they're getting nutrient dense foods in their diet.
I mean, but like then there's like baked Cheetos as like here's a healthy option.
Don't get me started. Okay.
Again, it's the whole health washing,
and that's a health washing and a marketing, and that's kind of a separate issue, right? But it is part of this. And the thing is that like none of these types of foods that they are really trying to get at here, right? Because what they're trying to get at is avoiding sugar sweetened beverages, refined, highly processed carbohydrates, and other foods that have a lot of added sugars, added sodium, and tend to be high in saturated fats. None of these types of foods were recommended by any means in previous guidelines.
Right.
And scientific reports, again, the reports that are coming out of the DGAC, the committee who's making these initial recommendations that go to the DGA, they have recommended limiting them to various degrees. Previous guidelines have never explicitly discouraged the consumption of these foods. They've been we've been recommended to avoid added sugars, to limit our amounts of added sugars and things like that. So it's really kind of the emphasis and the explicitness of this recommendation that's different.
You're right. Like this seems like theoretically a step in the right direction, but how is it going to translate to purchasing?
Exactly. And I think that theoretical part is so important because it's also the case that these highly processed, I'm going to call them what they actually are, which is ultra processed foods and processed foods in general tend to be less expensive. They tend to be more available, especially in low income areas. They are going to be more shelf stable. Many times they're fortified with a lot of vitamins and minerals that people might be lacking. And so to just blanket statement discourage all processed foods is really doing a disservice if we're not also changing the way that we regulate our foods, the way that we label our foods, and the way that we provide access to foods for people. And none of that is changing with these dietary guidelines.
Yeah, all it's going to do, well, no, not all it's going to do. One of the things it's going to do is change the way that foods market themselves to no longer be highly processed, like the new naked Doritos or whatever. Suddenly that's not an ultra-processed food? Like,
right. And what that also does is it contributes to a level of stigma or shame associated with certain foods.
Yes.
That
Guilty
we then
pleasures.
associated. Exactly. Yeah. And that contributes to issues of disordered eating as well as just discrimination. Like we could keep going.
A can of worms that is like a Costco-sized can of worms.
Yes. They go even further, though, in this section where they talk about avoiding highly processed foods, because they also specifically talk about limiting artificial food dyes. We know that they're railing against those, as well as preservatives, non-nutritive sweeteners. And if you haven't listened to our food dyes episode, we have a way deep dive on that. But the fact is there really isn't a ton of data to support these recommendations. There really isn't. We don't have data to say that we need to be avoiding X, Y, and Z preservatives or for what reason, or that artificial food dyes are in any way less safe than so-called natural food dyes, which again, they are just lifting restrictions on the ability to license and use various forms of quote-unquote natural derived food dyes.
Food dyes are not necessary, period.
No, right. And none of this, so that part is really not based in data, but it's lumped into this idea of avoiding highly processed foods. So again, that's a can of worms. And that's if there is a change that could potentially be for the better, that might be it. So moving on. Now, dairy has been, I think, contentious in guidelines for years. And for good reason. Yeah. Because honestly, the bottom line is that none of us over the age of 12 months need any form of dairy to survive as a species. 75% of the global population is lactose intolerant as adults and cannot consume dairy, period. Dairy is a good source of calcium. It has quite a lot of calcium in it, and 46% of Americans don't get enough calcium. Dairy in this country has to be fortified with vitamin D, and many of us don't get enough vitamin D. And then dairy contains protein, and it is high in saturated fat if you are drinking whole fat dairy. But for a long time, the guidelines not only emphasized the need for dairy. Dairy was its whole own food group, okay, which it still is. It is a front page recommendation on these guidelines before whole grains, before anything. But every other guideline in the past has emphasized the need to consume low-fat dairy. They have recommended specifically low-fat dairy items. And that is because of the data surrounding saturated fat intake. And the truth is that the more data that we have gotten to specifically look at dairy, low-fat dairy versus full-fat dairy, is that the data doesn't really bear out the idea that low-fat dairy is truly any healthier when it comes to cardiovascular disease, cholesterol, cardiovascular mortality, those kinds of things. So whether you're consuming low-fat milk or skim milk or whole milk, the data, the newer data, it's true, doesn't really, it doesn't bear out that whole milk is truly worse than low-fat, okay? Where it does make a difference is that whole milk dairy which is just as processed as low fat because they take out the fat and put it back in, but it is going to have more calories and it is going to have more saturated fat. And so if you're consuming that, you probably need to reduce the amounts that you're drinking in order to stay within whatever your calorie limits are going to be for the day, right?
Okay.
But the new guidelines on this very first page specifically recommend consuming whole fat, full fat dairy.
Yeah.
They don't say like pick a dairy of your choice. They specifically say you should be consuming whole fat dairy. There's no data to support that.
Right.
Necessarily. And again, there's no data that says that anyone needs to be consuming dairy whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And all of the previous guidelines have erred, at least the way that they have framed it, have erred on the side of caution, saying because we know the risks of saturated fat, even though we don't have a strong indication that low-fat dairy is substantially healthier or substantially more safe a choice than whole milk, we should err on the side of caution and recommend low-fat options to people.
Okay. I think I'm confused a little bit. Okay, so
give it to me.
So these studies, and this might not be like an answerable question, but like these studies that are showing that there's not necessarily a strong relationship between whole milk or whole fat milk or skim milk or whatever and health, is that if quantities are equal, like...
It's a great question. Our nutrition data is tough, right?
It is very tough.
It's really, most of them are just based on like changing a recommendation. So in like, for example, DASH diet studies, which is like the dietary approaches to stopping hypertension, or like Mediterranean diet studies where they have either allowed participants to have milk, whether they've recommended low-fat milk or recommended whole milk. Are they restricting how much people are drinking? Probably not. So people are probably drinking however much milk they're going to drink.
Okay.
And so, but in those, when they have kind of allowed people more leniency and switching from low fat to whole fat and things like that, there isn't that big of a difference really. But it's true.
And it is interesting too in the context of thinking about servings and like recommended servings. So it's like we're now recommending any type of fat, dairy fat amount versus...
Well, specifically, we're actually recommending whole fat.
Okay, well, there you go.
but
I mean, like, does that play? Yeah, it's just, I think it's the reason I say it's unanswerable is because like it's just there's lack of clarity in all of this and what the impact is. And I think it is really difficult to take data and then translate that to advice.
Yes, it is. It's really, really hard.
Okay.
But that is a change, a pretty good sized change that we see in these newest guidelines is the switch to emphasize the need to consume whole fat dairy products as like a very explicit recommendation. Okay?
Yeah,
now,
sure.
Next. Next is, I think, the one that you're probably most excited about, Erin. The war on protein.
Yeah. I'm waging this war. I'm starting now. I'm fighting back against the onslaught of protein in the grocery store.
The guidelines on realfood.gov, which is where you can find these guidelines, they really do specifically say that they are ending the war on protein.
As someone who lived through the 90s and the 2000s and the Atkins diet, I didn't realize that we were in a war.
I'll tell you what I think the war actually is, Erin.
Yeah.
Let me
is it the
get
war
through
on
it.
beef? Okay, go on.
Okay, yeah, listen. So this version of the dietary guidelines really puts protein on a huge pedestal, and it does so in two ways that are different from prior guidelines and not based in nutrition research or data. So first, these guidelines emphasize over and over again, both visually and in the text itself, a specific and explicit recommendation to consume your protein primarily from animal sources.
Right. I can picture the steak in that.
The steak.
In that pyramid. Yeah.
Ah, it's huge. They have a huge whole steak, an entire turkey, a package of ground beef, a chunk of raw salmon, and a carton of whole milk, all to represent your protein sources. Okay? They also, in the text, emphasize eggs, poultry, seafood, and red meat. And then later down the line say, like, you can get it from vegetable sources too, but don't you dare be vegetarian or vegan or you'll definitely end up deficient. There's like a whole section on that.
Great.
The nutrition data that we have, rife with biases and things and limited as all nutrition data is, all of the nutrition data that we do have point to plant sources of protein being associated with lower disease risks, lower mortality, better cardiovascular outcomes than animal proteins.
So that is what Atwater basically said. I mean, Atwater was like, get your protein however you can get your protein. Animal, plant, whatever. And then at least 70 years ago, it was known that plant protein was associated with lower
Better
incidence
health
of chronic
outcomes.
disease. Yeah.
Yes. Plant proteins are sufficient in terms of getting us enough quality of protein. And they, again, reduce cardiovascular disease risk, like over and over and over again in studies. Now, in these newest guidelines where they are making these recommendations, they don't provide any quantitative data to actually prove or any data to support this idea that animal proteins are actually healthier in any way, shape, or form. They don't even try to really back this up with any quantitative data.
Okay.
And we're going to get more into this in a second, but meat, especially red meat, like the giant steak that they have right there in the front of the triangle, is much higher in saturated fat than plant-based proteins. And we have decades of data. This is where our nutrition data is the strongest. Reducing saturated fat is beneficial for your cardiovascular health. Also, they don't even mention in these guidelines how strong of associations there are between red meat and processed meats and the fact that they're carcinogens, right?
Yes.
These are carcinogenic foods and associated with an increased risk of cancer. None of this is addressed in these guidelines. They just really focus on the need to consume animal-based protein. And the other thing that they specify for the first time in a dietary guidelines is a protein goal of 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. So for a 100 kilogram person, we're talking 120 to 160 grams of protein.
What's that in pounds? That's
Oh my God, I don't know. 2.2. So that would be 220 pounds.
Okay.
Wow, pulled that out. The current dietary reference intakes, which is separate from these DGAs, but that's getting into semantics. The recommendation is a goal of 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So this is up to doubling what the recommended target protein intake is. And the current evidence is that the vast majority of Americans, with some exceptions for maybe older adults, are getting about 1 gram per kilogram of protein. We're already meeting what the previous goals are. We are not deficient in protein whatsoever.
What would protein deficiency look like?
So protein deficiency can result in muscle wasting and things like that for sure. And it's a very real concern if you didn't have access to protein. And there's some data that in older Americans, especially over 70, 75, that having a protein deficit is associated with increased frailty and, that's a fall risk and things like that. But that's only in a subset of older Americans. The vast majority of everyone else is getting plenty of protein to support our daily needs and to support our bodily functions. The evidence that they cite, that they present in these guidelines to actually support this idea that we need more protein are a few studies, some of which show that with a high protein diet, people have more weight loss. That's it. They don't have any data to show that more protein is better for cardiovascular disease, for diabetes, for mortality, for cancer, for anything else. Just a few short-term studies, 68% of these 30 studies showed decrease in one weight-related metric, like BMI or waist circumference or something like that. So there's really no data to support this idea that we need more protein than what we're already getting. And excess dietary protein ends up converted into fat, which is going to increase your visceral adiposity. And that's the type of fat that puts people at risk of diabetes and metabolic disease.
Okay.
There's some evidence that increasing your protein intake, if you are doing intensive strength and resistance training, can increase your muscle mass. But they're not that's a separate subset and that's not the general population, because if we were all doing more strength training, that would be great for everyone, but we're not as a whole.
Okay, so what does this mean for, we should do an episode on protein. We really should. I've been wanting to do the keto diet for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
But what does this mean for the fact that, like, you know, we're seeing this now? How long has this been building, this war on protein rhetoric? Again, I still come back to the protein in every product that you see these days. Like, that's like the newest trend.
It is.
And what are the implications of that trend? Like, what are the outcomes going to be?
It's a great question. We don't know.
Will
it's a
there
really
be?
Great question, though. Because this sets us up for the protein marketing to be like, heck yes, thank you so much for doing this, right? We're already here. Now look at us. We're in the guidelines, right? Despite the fact that they're all ultra-processed foods.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the war on protein, Erin, the war on protein, from what I can tell, is that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, who published the initial recommendations that they did not use to make these new guidelines, specifically said that we need to have an emphasis on plant-based proteins. And they had the audacity to suggest that beans, peas, and lentils should be taken out of the vegetables group and grouped with the proteins group.
Which is wild because historically that's where it has been too.
Listen.
Beans were with meat. Legumes were with meat historically since the early days.
Yes, but peas, Erin, they're green.
I
Listen,
wonder when it switched. Okay.
That's the war. That is the war. That's the war on protein. I'm not done.
Okay, yeah.
The last, and I think the most egregious change, the ones that people are really kind of up in arms about, is the changes in terms of the recommendations on fat. And I hinted at this already.
Yes.
So just like every other guideline forever, these guidelines explicitly say that we should be limiting our total saturated fat intake to less than 10% of our diet. That has not changed.
Yeah.
Because the data to support that is so strong, that has not changed. However, the new guidelines say that we should be incorporating healthy fats, quote unquote healthy fats, and they repeatedly list butter and beef tallow many times as options for healthy fats. These fats are 50% saturated fat compared to liquid fats like olive oils, vegetable oils, seed oils, which are like 10% saturated fat. The guidance on saturated fat for years has been that saturated fat increases our LDL cholesterol, which is the type of cholesterol associated with cardiovascular disease, and saturated fat intake increases cardiovascular disease and mortality from cardiovascular disease. The data is like as strong as it gets when it comes to nutrition data. And there are so much data that shows that reducing our saturated fat, specifically in these ways, one, by replacing saturated fats like butter and lard and beef tallow with plant-based fats like olive oil, vegetable oil, seed oils, improves people's lipid profiles and reduces cardiovascular disease. And number two, replacing animal-based sources of saturated fat, including red meat and white meat and dairy products, with plant-based sources of proteins like legumes and whole grains and vegetables, reduces cardiovascular disease. These are not new data. These are longstanding. So these recommendations and the lumping of these sources of highly saturated fat as a healthy option is not based in data whatsoever. And to still say, like, we need to be eating animal-based protein, we need to be eating whole fat dairy products, we need to be using butter as our healthy fat, but we should be limiting our saturated fat intake to 10% of our diet. Like, that's not feasible. You can't do all of that.
It's contradictory.
Yeah.
And I think it's like, it's a little by design because it's like providing lip service to multiple different things at once without revealing what the true intention behind it is. If there is one, like, can
100%.
there be an aligned goal, or is it just like word vomit from RFK?
From word vomit mouths.
Yeah. From someone who's a pro.
And really, like, the way that they made these guidelines is also different than what you walked us through, Erin, of the typical how these dietary guidelines are made. And you told us last week that there has always been black boxes.
Yep.
There have always been concerns about industry ties. And there has always been a question of like, how do these dietary guidelines committee recommendations actually get turned into the DGA? And so what's kind of interesting is that in some ways, the way that they went about this was more transparent.
That the whole checklist of like, this is what the committee recommended, and here's what we did.
Here's
like,
what we did.
Whoa.
We ignored over 30 out of 50 of their recommendations, and we mostly ignored another 15 of them, and there's like 5 or 6 that we took.
Right.
So that part was more explicit. We still don't know who actually wrote any of these guidelines. That's still a black box. But there was also an entirely separate scientific advisory committee that RFK made, and he gave them a couple of months instead of a couple of years to do a so-called rapid review of the evidence. And then he had his own folks, again, black box, take those scientific rapid reviews and make the actual guidance from it.
Yeah. Certainly not an improvement on the process.
Not an improvement.
A worsening on the existing terrible structure.
Right. And the scientific advisors that wrote these scientific parts of the report also had tons of industry ties, every single one almost. So that part is really no different, even though they're trying to frame it as this is free from bias, etc. They also are very explicit in these guidelines that one of the things they really did not like about the previous guidelines is that they had the audacity to take into account things like health equity, ethnicity, culture, socioeconomic status, race. All of these things were considered in the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee's actual guidelines, recommendations. And this report has an entire paragraph saying, how dare you take that into consideration? That's not what we're doing here.
Yeah. I mean,
so points for that kind of transparency, right? And honestly, I think that one of the big things that these guidelines do is show the same exact trend that we've seen in pretty much everything that MAHA touches, whether it's raw milk, whether it's food dyes, whether it's anything, which is a real like rejection of any sort of scientific expertise and a remaking of facts to fit a specific agenda, being explicit about it, but then also a packaging and like a branding of these very real health issues that are indeed facing Americans as something that we could fix individually by just eating more broccoli and steak, right? Like we have huge issues in our health system, and as we have talked about and will continue to talk about, many of us struggle to meet these dietary guidelines, and people around the globe live with chronic diseases that poor nutrition has contributed to. But it will take structural changes to actually fix any of these issues, right?
Yeah, and a willingness to actually stand up to industry and require some sort of regulation over advertising, over what they can put on a label.
And none of that has happened thus far.
No.
Now, if we take a step back and look globally, pretty much every single country has some version of dietary guidelines. Many of them do use a little pyramid shape, which is so interesting. Why has that become the thing? And there's, of course, a lot of regional variation in like what countries are using as like their food examples, or like, are they calling things grains or starches or what have you? But across the board, there's a lot of very common themes that come out. Things like an emphasis on fish in many guidelines, an emphasis on lean meats and limiting or moderating meat consumption. That's in most other guidelines. Over half of countries have some specific messaging around increasing consumption of legumes and plant-based sources of protein. And about 75% of countries have some kind of messaging about dairy. So not all, but a good chunk of them. And most of them that have anything about dairy specifically mention low-fat milk or low-fat dairy products. And then pretty much all countries mention things like limiting fat to some degree. Some of them separate out the types of fat, and then limiting salt, limiting sugar, etc.
Okay.
I also love that some countries go like a few steps further, and like their dietary guidelines also include like conditions on how you should eat, or like recommendations on physical activity. Apparently in Brazil, dietary guidelines, I don't know if they still do this, but in 2015, they said that you should dine in company to develop relationships.
Oh, love that.
Isn't that so nice? Okay. So if we look very broadly and like we try and incorporate all of what these other country guidelines, the World Health Organization recommendations, and what like nutrition science more broadly tells us what really is the healthiest diet. If we look at the preponderance of evidence, a healthy diet seems to be one in which we get a wide variety of foods that are going to meet our macronutrients, so protein, fiber, carbohydrate, fat, and our micronutrient, so vitamins and minerals requirements. It's going to be one which relies primarily on plants, including vegetables, fruits, and whole grains. And for many of us, plant-based sources of protein are going to bring health benefits, and animal-based sources of protein can be incorporated as a part of a healthy diet. And across the board, based on all the evidence, the things that we should be limiting are saturated and trans fats, added sugars or free sugars, and sodium. And it is true that ultra-processed foods are very often high in sodium, sugar, and saturated fats.
Right.
That's the end.
So we have these guidelines, these ones that change every 5 years in the United States. We have other sort of society guidelines, or like these ones that where there's consistency across the globe. How are we doing? Is any of us meeting any of these guidelines?
I'm so glad that you asked, Erin. That's what I wanted to tell you next.
Okay, good.
So in the US, at least, we can look at the Healthy Eating Index 2020 is the most up-to-date ones that we have. They have a separate one for like children over age 2 and then another one for toddlers.
Okay.
But all across the board, we fail to align with any version of dietary guidelines for Americans. Okay?
Yeah.
Our standard American diet, which you can abbreviate as SAD,
Nice.
is indeed, it's pretty bad, right?
Yeah.
The mean healthy eating index scores for the total population was 56 out of 100. Goal is 100.
Okay.
And toddlers is 63 out of 100. So toddlers are doing a bit better, which is shocking to me based on my toddlers.
I mean, 63 though is still...
It's not great. Yeah. Probably my kid is much less than that. That's an average, right? And these data come from like a whole bunch of really wide-ranging surveys. Despite those abysmal overarching statistics, according to all of this data, the majority of individuals over age 1 are at or above dietary guideline recommendations for total grains, refined grains, which is maybe the less great option, total protein foods, protein, and meat, poultry, and eggs.
Okay.
So we're doing just fine there.
We're hitting things, yep.
Where we are falling short is vegetables, including all subgroups of vegetables, and they group them by like green versus red and orange versus, again, beans, peas, and lentils were in there as vegetables. We're falling short on fruits. We're falling short on the dietary guidelines recommendations for dairy or fortified soy alternatives.
Okay.
As well as seafood, nuts, seeds, soy products, and whole grains.
Okay.
So you might ask, as I did, why do we need recommendations telling us to emphasize protein and animal protein when we're already getting enough, if not too much, and we're falling short in so many other regards? If you want to go even deeper, and you know that I do, we can look at other like macronutrient profiles. Only 6% of us in the United States are meeting our fiber recommendations, which is 25 to 35 grams of fiber a day.
It's actually quite, so I've been a little bit obsessed with fiber because I feel like we have talked about this in something else, maybe it was the poop episodes or something.
Poop, yep.
And I was like, how much fiber am I? Like I had no concept of how much I was supposed to eat. Like, you can hear 25 grams, 30 grams or whatever, but like, what does that actually look like?
Right.
And it's a lot of fiber. It is. And so yesterday I sat down with John and I calculated his, not mine. Cause and also I've been taking fiber, I've been having fiber supplements and stuff, and trying to eat a lot of fiber. But John is just like, well, I think I eat a good amount of fiber. And I was like, do you? He does actually. He hit 30 grams. I was like, are you kidding me?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I thought he only ate chicken.
No, he's a big smoothie vegetable guy. And so it's like most of the day is smoothie vegetables and then it's chicken and vegetables at night. And
That's great.
Like rice. I think that like it was really a good exercise for me to be like, okay, what does this actually look like?
Yes.
In terms of consuming fiber.
Right. And fiber is like, it is the one thing that I do a lot of counseling on in all of my primary care visits, my preventive care visits when we're talking about food and diet, because it's also that like foods that are high in fibers tend to be also the foods that are good plant proteins, and they have a lot of other micronutrients and things. So like to get your fiber from whole food sources, you are also shifting the overall diet profile that you're eating, which is like, fiber's great. Now, 89% of us are getting too much sodium. Yeah. See our salt episode for more.
I include myself in that. Yeah.
65% of us are eating more than 10% of our calories in added sugar, which is a lot. 82% of us are eating more than 10% of our calories from saturated fat already before these recommendations to increase animal protein, to increase the fat in your dairy, to use butter. And it's only older adults. About 5 to 15% of older adults are maybe not getting enough protein. And that's like a low percentage compared to all of these other numbers. It is true, though, like that our nutrition in the US is not great and it impacts our health. It's estimated that $700 billion each year is spent on healthcare costs related to nutrition-related chronic diseases, right? So these do have huge consequences on individual and public health. So if we are falling short in these areas, why? Like, what are the barriers that people are facing? And who is going to face, or who is going to see the impact of these newest changes that we're seeing? That's where I want to go next. There are very substantial differences in access to food and in health outcomes in this country based on race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status. Now, in this country, race and ethnicity contribute so hugely to differences in dietary intake, and it's largely due to historic marginalization and structural racism that's driving inequalities in socioeconomics and education. These are the two biggest factors, socioeconomics and education, that are associated with diet quality. We also see huge geographic differences in the US. People in rural United States and in food deserts, whether in rural or urban areas, have substantially lower quality diets. And there's socioeconomics and historic redlining and food deserts where even if you have food, like let's say your bodega on the corner carries fresh fruits and vegetables, they're going to be sky-high prices compared to the Walmart, which is out in the burbs that you can't get to because you don't have a car. Right?
Yeah.
So there's huge amounts of inequalities in our food system, and that is baked into our food system. The scientific report from the Dietary Guidelines Committee that was not used to make these guidelines really emphasized the need for us to do more research on those aspects, for us to understand what those drivers are and how we can actually address them systematically.
Right.
And the Dietary Guidelines said, absolutely not, we will not be doing that.
Right. Period. We are not going to acknowledge anything beyond personal choices.
Exactly. 100%.
Yeah.
But if our personal choices are that we're not eating according to these guidelines anyways, then what, like you asked last week, what impact are these changes really going to have? And I think that one of the things that's important is that because these dietary guidelines are guiding policy for school lunch programs, for military nutrition programs, for what is covered by WIC, or the Women, Infants, and Children, which serves over 47 million people, these changes specifically to increase things like full-fat dairy, to increase protein recommendations, to avoid processed foods, these could result in pretty substantial changes being integrated into what foods are available in schools. Now, my kid goes to a public school and gets breakfast and lunch at public school, which is wonderful. Thank you, State of California. But the food choices that he gets are often quite bad. Like he eats graham crackers for breakfast because those count as whole grains. I'm not even joking.
Yeah, no, I know you're not. I mean, this is like Cinnamon Toast Crunch is a whole grain cereal.
He gets Cinnamon Toast Crunch whole grain, low sugar Cinnamon Toast Crunch quite often. He brings home the little packets sometimes.
5% reduced sugar now.
Yes. And you know what? They don't taste as good, but that's besides the point.
Well, but that is the point. But yeah.
Yes. But so it is possible that these changes could result in choices that are higher in whole grains, that are lower in sugar, and that are lower in sodium. And that would not be a bad thing. That would be a really good thing. Mm-hmm. Will there be increased budgets for this? Because those foods are going to cost more money. Mm-hmm. So will this result in better food choices, or will it result in less access? Mm-hmm. Will departments and programs have to decide, you know what, we can't give universal school lunch anymore. We have to go back to having income limits on who can actually access school lunch, which again, that's a bigger issue and has a whole bunch of things associated with it, right? Universal school lunch is an amazing thing. So is there going to be budgets for this to be able to implement and incorporate any of these recommendations into policy changes? Will increasing full-fat dairy be beneficial for kids? Will it end up having more calories because they're still going to be drinking chocolate milk because that's what they all choose, right?
Yeah.
And I think that we don't know, right? We literally just don't know. We don't know how this is all going to happen, how it's all going to shake out. So time will tell is the short answer of how are these going to be impacted? In theory, medical professionals and nutrition professionals also rely on these guidelines when they're counseling patients.
Or when learning in their training.
Mm-hmm. Are they going to rely on these guidelines, or are we going to see what we've seen with the dissolution of the ACIP, where all of the other professional organizations make their own guidelines, and that's actually what's used, and no one's even using these guidelines? We don't know. I do think, like we talked about earlier, what is so different about the way that these guidelines are being presented is how they are being marketed and how much they are being marketed to the American public directly. And they're doing so under this guise of caring about people's health, while at the same time examining any socioeconomic determinants of health, rejecting science in a lot of ways for their own individual interests. And then also marketing this with commercials like the one with Mike Tyson that shames foods, that shames people's bodies for what size their body actually is. Again, without any meaningful policy change to make sure that people have access to foods or have the time to engage in physical activity or any of these other things that we know would be beneficial. So I don't know, Erin. I am skeptical that there's going to be a lot of benefit that comes out of wrapping up these nuggets of truth or these nuggets of what we know to be quote unquote common sense in what is so hard to disentangle good advice from ideology that's not based in reality.
Science, industry, ideology.
Yep.
Where does it all, what does the pie chart look like?
Right.
It's different for each different thing. And
it is.
There are consistencies. And I think highlighting those global consistencies is really, it's really interesting because there are things that haven't really changed. And there are maybe minor changes from year to year as far as these go. But we do have a roadmap. And it's just that there's an unwillingness, especially from the federal government, to provide the funding or the resources to enable everyone to use that roadmap.
100%. The other thing that I swear, this is my very last point, Erin.
We'll see. No, just kidding.
Because I don't have time to get into it, but I feel like it's an important thing that I don't want to just gloss over entirely. The impact of dietary guidelines on climate change.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. There's really wide ranges in emissions estimates of various specific countries' recommended diets. And if the entire world was eating an old US diet, not even the newest recommendations, it would substantially increase global greenhouse gas emissions. And now with an emphasis on dairy and an even stronger, we always had an emphasis on dairy, but a stronger emphasis on dairy and a stronger emphasis on animal protein at the expense of plant protein, that is also going to result, if it is incorporated, in more greenhouse gas emissions, worsening of climate change. There was also changes with like alcohol and making it much more ambiguous what the recommendations are and not explicitly saying you should not be drinking alcohol, period.
Yeah.
Which is what the old guidelines actually said. They were like, no one should be drinking alcohol. If you are going to, it should be no more than 1 to 2 a day, depending on who you are. And now the new ones are just like, limit your alcohol consumption, which like, what does that mean? Now I swear I'm actually done, Erin.
Yeah. No, I mean, you bring up a good point about emissions, and it's all. I think what it also reveals is just like how much of this again is about American agriculture,
yes,
and interest in that area.
100%.
Yeah. Tell us where we can learn more about this.
Well, of course, you can read all of these guidelines for yourself. I've got links to the report that came out in 2024, and then the scientific foundation that they wrote, the new scientific committee that RFK wrote, as well as the several-page dietary guidelines document. It's all there. I also have some data like going back on previous dietary guidelines so that you can kind of see the evolution. And then a bunch of papers about the global, there was a couple really great ones. One from 2019 that was called A Global Review of Food-Based Dietary Guidelines from Advances in Nutrition. And then another one from 2021 that was a comparison of dietary guidelines among 96 countries worldwide. I've got that climate change paper. It was from 2018, so it's a little bit old now. But anyways, we got so much there for you on our website, thispodcastwillkillyou.com.
Yes. Thank you to Bloodmobile for providing the music for this episode and all of our episodes.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Liana and Tom and Pete and Mark and Jess and everyone at Exactly Right for everything that you do to make this podcast possible.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks, listeners. Tell us what you think. We're curious. What do you think?
Did you like this episode?
Yeah.
We had fun. And thank you, as always, to our patrons. Your support really does. It means so much to us. So thank you.
It does. Until next time, wash your hands.
You filthy animals.